Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about bad long COVID clinical trials, unethical clinical trials, useless clinical trials. I'm afraid we're going to get a lot of these in the years to come. We already have a taste of it from the Yale investigators. They got a new study that they are marketing on social media that's going to be about long COVID, and I'm going to walk through this study, why I think it's problematic, and why I think more research in the long COVID space is going to be a big problem going forward. First of all, what do you need to know? You need to know that long COVID has no agreed upon definition. It's people who've had COVID and recovered from COVID who have some types of symptoms thereafter at some period of time, and there isn't a lot of agreement on what those symptoms are and how long thereafter. There's also not even a lot of agreement on whether or not they needed to have COVID. Some of the original definitions did not even require a positive COVID test or a positive antibody test. They said you might have gotten COVID without even knowing it or having it undetectable. If you feel like you've got long COVID, you got long COVID. But let's set that aside. Let's just set aside for a moment the lack of agreed upon definition, the lack of a biological mechanistic understanding. Let's just agree upon the fact that there are people, and this is true, who suffer from long COVID and feel as if it's attributable to COVID-19. And anytime that situation exists in biomedicine, it makes sense to take those people and try different therapeutic strategies. Early in the pandemic, I suggested that there can be randomized trials for long COVID sufferers for all sorts of medications like Prozac, for instance, which has some activity in even COVID, or perhaps venlafaxine, or who knows what else. You know, it could be anything you wanted. It could be from medication being repurposed to even Paxlovid. Sure, have at it. You can run randomized trials of different drugs or other strategies, even cognitive behavioral therapy, even exercise, which was something that got in the news because people didn't like that idea. But you can run these trials to see what makes the people who suffer this condition feel better, even if one doesn't have a great idea of what's the cause or what the definition is. You can just have some clinical trial inclusion criteria and run your randomized trial. Now, what you can't do is run a really, really crappy study. If you run a really, really crappy study, you might as well run no study at all. And that's what's going on in this recent Yale study. This is entitled A Decentralized Randomized Phase 2 Efficacy and Safety Study of Paxlovid, which is nirmatrelvir and ritonavir in adults with long COVID. Okay, Paxlovid is two drugs. It's ritonavir, which inhibits a part of a drug metabolism, the cytochrome P450 system, 3A4. And if you have ritonavir inhibiting that, you can get a boost of other drugs. And so the Paxlovid drug, the novel drug, the nirmatrelvir, that's getting a little bit of a boost. And ritonavir is used as a boost for all sorts of HIV therapeutics. So the fact that Paxlovid is a combination of these two drugs, that's acceptable. No problem. It's a drug that's boosting the other drug that they think has some efficacy. The control arm of this study is what we got to talk about. What should we compare this to among patients with long COVID? That's going to be a key question. The next thing to talk about is the sample size of the study. How big is the study going to be? And who's funding the study? Of course, Pfizer. Oh, good old Uncle Pfizer. Pfizer has done really well in this pandemic. They made $100 billion, even though many of the things they made money for lacked robust evidence that they improved hard outcomes for the people who got them. For instance, did you know that Paxlovid only has positive randomized controlled trial data in high-risk adults, people who are at high risk of COVID-19 progression, who have not had COVID-19 before and not been vaccinated? And yet Paxlovid is given to, that's right, low-risk adults who've had COVID before potentially and been vaccinated and or boosted multiple times. This is called indication drift, where you drift from the evidence to a land of medical practice called horseshit medicine. It's just make-believe. It's just a greedy extrapolation. We've never liked this in medicine. When you do this, when you take a drug that works under very strict circumstances and fall down the risk curve, you're very likely not to work as well and sometimes even to cause harm. But that didn't stop this administration from pushing Paxlovid relentlessly, probably because they bought a lot of it. They bought billions of dollars of it before they had the trial results. But what's really weird to me is that the key members of the Biden administration who oversee this, they don't ask Pfizer to do the right randomized control trials. They did one in vaccinated people called EPIC-SR. That's a negative study. They finally posted those results on clinicaltrials.gov. There's an ongoing study in the United Kingdom called Panoramic, which is much bigger. But why didn't we demand in the United States, I don't know, evidence that our $10 billion investment in the Pfizer Corporation is actually making people better off? That's a problem, and I think it smells like regulatory capture to me. I think it stinks. It's also bad medicine. It is very, very bad in medicine to prescribe drugs to people you have no idea if you're benefiting. This is COVID-19, okay? We're talking about Paxlovid given to people who actually have COVID. The ongoing study in long COVID is for Paxlovid among people who have long COVID, which is a little bit different because presumably the COVID-19 is long gone. Now they got the long COVID. Well, this study has some inclusion criteria for participants in long COVID. It's a decentralized study. And here's the key. It is a 1-to-1 randomized control trial, meaning that of these 100 people, presumably going to be randomized 50-50, double-blind superiority placebo-controlled trial, which means you're going to try to prove the Paxlovid is better in non-hospitalized symptomatic adult participants with long COVID. Okay, so you have to have long COVID. You can't be hospitalized. Okay, you have to have symptoms from it. And you're going to get 15 days of Paxlovid versus placebo ritonavir. Wait a second. The intervention arm is nirmatrelvir ritonavir, Paxlovid, and the control arm is placebo ritonavir. But in the absence of this study, would you take a long COVID patient and give them ritonavir, 100 milligrams BID? I think you wouldn't do that because that's not really an inert substance. That's actually a drug. It's a drug at 100 milligrams that's actually inhibiting their cytochrome P450 system. It's actually something that has side effects. It is very difficult to track down the side effects of 100 milligrams BID. There's a whole literature on ritonavir 600 milligrams BID, which was the original dose, by the way. That's an HIV legacy. But the 100 milligrams BID, I was looking for phase 1 clinical trials that could tell me what was the AE or adverse event profile of this dose. Indeed, in children, you can find that even at doses as low as 250 milligrams a day, children experience side effects like nausea, vomiting. Some even have dose reductions and they still can't get over it. They have to discontinue the product. And for 100 milligrams of ritonavir BID, couldn't find a great study to look at adverse events, but I did find this. After 14 days of ritonavir 100 milligrams BID, these are in healthy adults, 20 healthy HIV-negative seroadults with baseline lipids or cholesterol. Total cholesterol increased by 10.2%, LDL increased by 16.2%, triglycerides levels increased by 26.5%, and HDL cholesterol decreased by 5.4%. In other words, it's making your cholesterol profile shitty. It's making your cholesterol profile shitty even with 14 days of treatment. It is a biologically active substance. It has no business being in the control arm of this study. It's not already approved for people with long COVID. It has no place in the treatment of long COVID. It is, in fact, if you give me ritonavir right now for 14 days, presumably you're harming me. You're worsening my cholesterol profile, and I'm having a toxic agent enter my body that has no justification. So this trial, prima facie, that the Yale investigators are running is, that's right, it's unethical. It's unethical because the control arm is beneath the standard of care at the time. A control arm that's beneath the standard of care, worse than what you would otherwise do, is arguably an unethical clinical trial. It exposes participants to harm without potential for benefit and actually cognitively makes no sense. Because I don't want to know if Paxlovid is better than taking ritonavir 100 milligrams for 2 weeks, which is not something anyone is doing. I want to know if Paxlovid is better than thinking you get Paxlovid. That's the key. Thinking you get Paxlovid should be the control arm because I want to know if the medical value of Paxlovid is better than the psychological value of taking a pill. Now, you might argue that what's the best way to think you got Paxlovid? It's a pure placebo. It's just pure sugar. I would contend that a pure sugar placebo is not the best way to think you got Paxlovid. Paxlovid has a metallic taste, people report. People report other symptoms from Paxlovid. What I would love to see is a placebo with a little bit of metallic taste. This is called active placebo. There's a large branch of literature on active placebos. And an active placebo is not ritonavir 100. Okay, an active placebo would not change your LDL by 16 points or whatever it was. An active placebo won't affect your cholesterol. It'll just give you a bit of metallic taste. So the first problem with this Yale study, this study run by Pfizer, is that we're randomizing people to Paxlovid, this combo drug, versus ritonavir. But the control arm is not what you should be doing. It's unethical. Okay, it's not. It's harmful. I mean, it's putatively harmful because they may have side effects from the drug that are like actually bad side effects that will bring them down, different than an active placebo with just a hint of metal taste, just to fool you into thinking you got it. And it changes cholesterol indices. Okay, I can find a study that documents that. That's a problem for you. Okay, the second problem, the sample size of the long COVID study. It's 100 people. Now, how much money did Pfizer make in the last couple of years? That's right, they made a shit ton. It's $100 billion. They're making money hand over fist because this administration allows them to sell their products with no evidence at all. Their fall booster is going to come to market with no clinical trial data at all. And their booster after booster in young men who've had COVID is, in my opinion, a harmful medical intervention. It certainly lacks evidence of efficacy, that it improves outcomes, and this administration allows them to make money from this. Okay, so these are ill-gotten gains. Now, of course, some of their gains are legitimately gotten. I think the initial dose in older people who didn't prior have COVID improved outcomes a great deal, but that's the eternal fallacy of medicine. That the same medicine that works really well in somebody who's at really high risk and really vulnerable might work less well or even be harmful in someone who's at much lower risk and not as vulnerable. This is the eternal truth of medicine across all drug classes, across all interventions. The same intervention, stenting in MI, might be great, but stenting for chronic stable angina might not be so great. And the same principles apply here. The question is Pfizer making more money from the people they're saving, or are they making the bulk of their revenue from their universal campaign to medicalize all of society? And it looks increasingly like it's the latter. Okay, it looks like the latter. So they got a lot of money, and they're doing a randomized control trial of 100 people, which is also delinquent. It is delinquent because, as one statistician writes on the internet in reply to my tweet, quote, read the power, 100 patients per arm. Oh, I'm sorry, it's 100 per arm, not 100 total. Okay, 100 per arm, 200. It's still abysmally small. 100 patients per arm is something as noisy as long COVID has little chance of showing anything. Any potential signal is likely to be way smaller than the noise. That's what a biostatistician writes in reply to me, and he's exactly right. 100 person per arm, okay, whatever, it's still abysmally small. Randomized control trial is not going to tell you anything. It's much more likely to find a false positive. It's woefully underpowered. They don't show me their power calculation, but it's woefully underpowered. The primary endpoint of this study is the NIH Promise 29 summary score, a physical health summary score questionnaire. They've got many, many secondary endpoints. One of the secondary endpoints is the difference in the number of hospitalizations and deaths, which is pretty stupid if you've only got 100 people per arm. That's going to be a totally noisy variable. I don't even know why you're looking at it. But let's go to the primary endpoint. They think this is going to make you have less symptoms. Sure, if you want to do that, you need a sample size so robust you can detect the minimally clinically important difference. You need a control arm that's an active placebo and not an actual drug that shouldn't be given to people, okay? Now, since your clinical trial has a woefully small sample size so that it's much more likely to find noise rather than signal, since your clinical trial does not use an appropriate control arm, your clinical trial, no matter what the result, is going to be the subject of fierce debate. And in fact, many people won't believe it. And in fact, it can't actually give us the answer to the question. And this is a forgotten principle of medical trial ethics. Any clinical trial that cannot answer a meaningful clinical question is in itself unethical. Okay? It's an unethical clinical trial. In order to even justify approaching people and running a trial, you have to be capable at the outset of answering a clinical question. They're not in this study. So, to put it all together, long COVID studies, okay to run, even with the nebulous definition. It might have been nice to try to figure out what is the actual definition. Might have been nice. We've published some papers on this. Might have been nice to actually have some consensus here, actually do some biology here, have some good studies to show if it's even an entity, if it's even a thing that exists beyond what might exist after any respiratory virus. Might have been nice, but put that aside. People are suffering no matter what the cause. If you can sort of create some inclusion criteria, you can run a randomized study of any product. I actually think Prozac is the best choice to run because it actually has antiviral properties and it has other things that might benefit somebody. Okay? Absolutely the case. So, they don't want to do that, of course, because that's a drug that's generic, so that's not going to make a lot of money. Obviously, we don't want to be testing those generic drugs. We want to be testing Paxlovid, for which we have the patent. That's okay too. Actually, you can test Paxlovid, but you need a sample size that's big enough to give you something useful. Not so much here, 100 per arm. And you need a control arm that is not harmful, but actually neutral and fools you into thinking you're getting the active agent, and that's an active placebo. a sugar pill with just a little touch of metallic taste on it, and not actually ritonavir, for which I can find documentation that even at these doses given, there is an adverse event profile, and I can find documentation that it changes your lipid profile. That's harmful intervention. So this clinical trial, because it's really shitty, is an unethical clinical trial. It can't answer any clinical question. What makes it so interesting is that you can't, it's sponsored by Pfizer, of course, but you can't say, we don't have enough money to have a sample size of 1,000 per arm. Because you can't say that because you have 100 billion reasons why you could do that. So why are they doing it? Why are they doing it? I think, and the real point of this video is not to beat up on this clinical study, which is trash, obviously. You know, it says we'll randomize 100 participants. Is it really 50 per arm or 100 per arm? I got to come back to this. The statistician says 100 per arm. I think he might be being generous. We'll randomize 100%. I think it's maybe 50 per arm. Either way, 50 per arm, 100 per arm, it's a piece of shit. Okay, all right. So what's the point here? We are going to get a deluge of long COVID studies that are low sample size, low credibility, poor control arm studies that will have no generalizability. When you run many, many underpowered studies, by chance alone, you will get false negatives, but you also get false positives. You'll get a whole bunch of putative compounds that look pretty promising. And guess what? If you've bought a shit ton of packs of it like this administration has, and this study gives you some signal, even if it's total BS, that the product might be beneficial, people will be running to packs of it and taking it. You are really opening up Pandora's box for snake oil therapies. What's the point here? Throughout this pandemic, many of us, myself included, were critical of people who clung to the idea that COVID could be tamed by some vitamin, mineral, some repurposed drug. In the absence of good randomized evidence that that's true, those people say, well, the randomized trials are flawed. And I say to them the same thing I say to the toddler maskers, which is, it's up to you. Okay, you want us to do something. You prove your intervention works. You run the trial the way you want to. The burden of proof is on those who make the claim, not those who are skeptical of the claim. So you think it works, you run the right trial and show them that it works. You haven't done that. The same thing for the toddler maskers. They haven't done that. And by the way, they can never do that because that's a really ludicrous idea that would probably fail in any way you ever try to implement it. Show me how you can implement your strategy. Here, what happens is you allow all these low credibility studies to be run. Some will be false positives, and we will just create a deluge of snake oil medicine in the long COVID space. This is being encouraged by Pfizer because they have every reason to do so. They're going to make money, and it's being signed on to by investigators who seem to have forgotten some of the basic principles of trial design. And it's no better. These are the same people who are critical of people for clinging to vitamins and supplements that don't work. And they're running clinical trials that are just as worthless. So it's the pot calling the kettle black, in my opinion. The only difference is this pot is in the establishment, and that kettle is out there in the wastelands of the internet. I mean, that's the fringe, and this is the establishment. The establishment, if they conduct science as poorly as the fringe, then they are not the establishment. They are just two fringes of deranged people, which is, I think, what we're living in. So, long COVID. No matter what people are suffering, so you can do randomized studies to see what will ameliorate their suffering. Again, I would suggest Prozac because that actually has some data in COVID-19, dubious quality, but it has something, and it has another reason why it might help long COVID. But Paxlovid, okay, but sample size has to be higher, and the control arm can't be ritonavir, something that's harming somebody's cholesterol indices. I bet these people may even find that Paxlovid had better cholesterol numbers than the control arm, and they're going to celebrate that. That would be crazy. Who knows what they'll do? They're also looking at they're looking at death and hospitalization, which is a ludicrous thing to do when you have a sample size so small. Is it really 100 per arm or 50 per arm? I just can't believe if it's 50 per arm. I don't think that statistician could believe it's 50 per arm, but I think it's 50 per arm. It says we randomize 100 people. God. What a terrible study. Last point. The investigators who are conducting long COVID work, they have labs that are swallowing NIH research dollars in long COVID. They love to tout the VA studies about long COVID. You do see that they have every professional incentive to make long COVID a big thing. They can go out there with their drum and bang on it and say how bad long COVID is, and that helps them, their career. That's a big problem. We don't have long COVID research funding in my group because we're not pretending that we're going to be able to solve it and find something in the nucleus of the cell that caused it. We're not making these sorts of bullshit claims. but other people are, and they're running these clinical studies that are woefully underpowered with an inadequate control arm. That's going to be a problem. We are very likely to see 1,000 to 10,000 low-scale randomized clinical trials of garbage things for long COVID. We'll probably see less than 10 credible, large, randomized trials. I would bet the success rate of the very large, by that I mean 5,000 or more per arm, randomized control trials is going to be close to 0%, if the control arm is actually not sugar pill but active placebo, even, as close to zero as it gets. But the positive rate of these studies is at least going to be the p-value. 5% of null results will be, 5% of the time you'll see sort of a significant p-value under the null hypothesis. You'll at least get that. You might get even higher if you have bias in addition to just the mere statistical vagaries of the study. And it's going to be a disaster, a total disaster. Unethical study, paid for by a company that could afford to pay for more, so that gives you sort of a question. Useless control arm, in fact, probably delinquent. Should have been halted by the IRB. Of course, they don't know anything about anything. They exist only to make it harder to do retrospective chart reviews, and they don't seem to give a fuck about any actual problematic studies. The most useless thing bureaucracy set up was the IRB. And yet they allow this. It's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. And at the end of the day, you know who really suffers? I guess a few groups of people. People who have long COVID genuinely suffer. If you run underpowered studies and you hype it and you do sort of BS laboratory work and you do horrible VA retrospective ICD-10 code studies, you're really harming people who might actually be suffering because you create a false idea of this whole disease and you're not getting at the real biology. Just terrible for those people. By running the bad clinical trial, you might give them a medicine that actually doesn't benefit them, and you might give them a false impression of that. Sure, I think society is also harmed. Society's harmed because we have to pay for these useless things that don't work based on underpowered studies that are pretty useless at the outset. I think science itself is harmed because we, maybe not everyone will recognize, but those of us who still have brains that work will recognize that we are conducting science as bad as even the most obnoxious fringe elements of the internet, and ergo we have no legitimacy, and we're just a political pawn in a broader game, and this thing that science, this real thing where you can actually find some objective reality, is itself being subjected to political pressures, and there is nobody bright who's running the show here in science. That's a very disheartening thing to come to the conclusion, and I think we're going to be harmed, and our reputation will be harmed. Everyone's going to be harmed from this. The only people who benefit, of course, is Pfizer. They're going to make a lot of money. The investigators are going to get a publication. A lot of people who are on the internet who like to tweet about new studies, they're going to have something for the grist, some grist to mill. They're going to have something to talk about. But most people who understand the situation will know this ain't good. So those are my thoughts on long COVID BS studies. If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. I'll be back with more videos. Got to go do my day job. And we'll see. We'll see what comes out next. All right. Until next time.